Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be from the 17th chapter of Proverbs, or at least as much as we can cover in 15 minutes. Now, the book of Proverbs is distinct from the majority of the New Testament in that the majority is arranged in a narrative format and has all the characteristic that entails, namely character interaction and plot development. But the book of Proverbs is really a series of Proverbs, which is a literary device which isn't unique to the Hebrew culture. What Proverbs are is sayings of condensed wisdom. So really it's as much wisdom, it's a short saying that really packs a punch and carries more than the sum of its own weight. An example of an American proverb writer would be Benjamin Franklin. But the Hebrew Proverbs are distinct from every other cultures in that they're inspired. That is to say, divinely so. And they were written by Solomon, who was also the third and final king of the United Kingdom of Israel. The reason I selected the 17th one is that the book of Proverbs as a whole carries no identifiable organizational pattern according to the themes in which they are arranged. But the 17th proverb, with the exception of the final two verses, each of the verses carries no relational resemblance to its predecessor or successor, so each carry their own train of thoughts, and we're going to analyze some of them today. Verse 1 reads, "Better is a dry piece of bread and rest with it than a house filled with the offerings of strife." Now Solomon was not an average man. He had absolute power, he had unprecedented wealth, unprecedented wisdom. But one doesn't really need to be average in order to understand the average man. He was a man with uncanny insight, and the weight of scriptural data suggests from the book of Ecclesiastes, which he also wrote, also in the book of genre of Old Testament wisdom literature. It's really his struggle to find the meaning of life, and they suggest that Solomon was a man who struggled with peace of an internal nature. His soul was restless because he had all the money, all the fame, all of the things that the natural man covets, but he still struggled with peace of an inner dilemma. But being a man prone to contemplation, we can infer that being at court and all the busyness that we can imagine, that he may have longed for the simpler life. So from that we draw this inference. And I had earlier mentioned that each of the verses carries no relational resemblance to its predecessor or successor. But a discerning mind developed through diligence can perceive counterintuitive connections. So what I'm going to do is combine the second verse with verse 3b. Verse 2 reads, "A wise servant rules over a son who causes shame and shares an inheritance among the brothers." 17b reads, "But Yahweh tries the heart." The foundation for this connection is going to be the term primogenitor. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. It's one of those words I've read but never actually heard, which has basically been the historical norm of most civilizations, and through which the firstborn or eldest son receives the exclusive or primary rights of inheritance. But the Bible not only accepts cultural norms, but consistently so. And we read this from the beginning. Adam's first two sons were Cain and Abel, and we read that Abel earned the divine favor. Cain incurred the divine displeasure through his inferior sacrifice, and this prompted his jealousy, leading to the first murder. And we read that Adam had many sons after Seth, but it was, or around Seth. We can imagine that there's obviously much more people that sprang from his loins than are mentioned in the Bible, but a righteous remnant is preserved through Seth, through Noah, 10 generations in between. Then 10 generations after, the righteous remnant is preserved through Abraham, who becomes the father of the Jewish nation, or Hebrew people. And Abraham was a man who, his wife Sarah was past the childbearing age, but God had promised him that he was going to be the father of many nations, and his struggle to conceive a child eventually compels him to conceive one through his servant girl, Sarah's servant girl, Hagar, an Egyptian, and that son's name was Ishmael. And but we read that he's not to be the chosen seed of promise. The other son, Isaac, is to be the one. And in the book of Galatians, Paul describes or categorizes the children who live by the flesh as the seed of Ishmael, and people who live by the Spirit or through faith as the heirs of Isaac, the chosen son. And of course, the Isaac would be the ancestors of the Muslim people, and the intricacies of this evolution are beyond the range of the present discourse, but for now it suffices to say that the seed of favor was clearly vested in the second-born son. And then we read of the two sons of Isaac, Esau and Jacob. And Esau was the father's favorite because of his hunting ability, but the favoritism of the Heavenly Father was clearly vested in Jacob, through whom the 12 tribes of Israel sprang, and his favorite son was Joseph, the one with the most ability, who preserved the family and then saved an entire nation of Egypt. He was the firstborn of his beloved wife. The 12 sons of Jacob mostly sprang from different wives, but his beloved Rachel, and so he was not the firstborn son, but he was the son of favoritism. And then several centuries later, we read that the Israel's first king was a man, the model monarch was David. The first king was Saul, but when he had disappointed in the expectations, the prophet Samuel was sent to investigate in a town of Bethlehem, where the Savior will be born 1,000 years later. And there he met a man named Jesse, who was the father of David. But David was not the firstborn son. He was, in fact, the youngest one. And when Samuel was instructed, when Samuel was examining the respective sons, David was the least impressive, physically speaking, but Yahweh told him that Yahweh tries the hearts, or weighs the hearts. The man looks at the outer appearance, but Yahweh weighs the hearts. And he found David, we read in Acts 13:22, was a man found after the heart of God. So that draws our connection to them. And Solomon, of course, was not the firstborn son of David. He was the secondborn of his adulterous liaison with Bathsheba. And the son that David appeared to favor was Absalom, who, of course, tried to usurp him and lead a rebellion. So that draws our connection between the two. And so the Bible, as we read, consistently upsets the cultural norms. Verse 3a reads, "A refining pot is for silver, and a furnace of gold for gold." The Bible often refers to the refining of spirituality. They use physical symbolisms to teach spiritual truths, and refining is often compared to a burning process, in that it initially stings, but it ultimately refines or makes one better, or more fit. Verse 4 reads, "An evildoer gives heed to wicked lips, a liar gives ears to tongue of desire." Basically, that means people seek the message they want to hear. They keep the company they want to keep. If you're prone to wickedness, you're going to surround yourself with wicked people. And we remember the book of Proverbs was directed, and we read in verse 1:8, to his son. So it's questionable to what extent that Solomon was writing with posterity in mind. But all of his principles are applicable for everyday believers. He who mocks the poor reproaches his maker. He who rejoices at calamity does not go unpunished. That's verse 5. And basically, if there's anything we read that all humans bear the image of God, no matter what age, race, gender, or socioeconomic status. We all have the same intrinsic equality before our Maker. And this was essential for a ruler to mete out impartial justice. And the book of Proverbs is not a series of promises, but principles. So the general principle, he who rejoices at calamity does not go unpunished. That's a principle, but of course we know that's not always true, at least not in the immediate sense. But the promise is that all wrongs will be righted at the judgment day. Children's children are the crown of old men, and the adornment of children is their fathers, reads verse 6. This reminds us of a passage in Psalms in which children are compared to bows of a quiver, and that the man who has many is blessed. And we already covered how the Bible treats all children, not necessarily the firstborn or the elder, as the most favorite. Excellent speech is not fitting for a fool, much less lying lips for a noble. That bears some resemblance to verse 5 in that you're not going to hear excellent speech is not fitting for a fool means it's unbecoming them. You know, any fool can read a scripted passage, but really it's not going to mean a lot coming from them. And present is a stone of favor in the eyes of its owner. Wherever he turns, he prospers. This is basically a self-evident statement. A lot of the Proverbs are self-evident and almost questionable to what extent wisdom really went into them. But the fact is that common sense and uncommon wisdom, rare is the man who can combine them both, and we do witness this in Solomon. He had a knack for simplicity and a sense of the extraordinary and the uncommon wisdom, we may call it. He who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends, reads verse 9. And a lot of Proverbs are arranged antithetically. That means the first half of the verse compares the ways of one side of an opposite, be it the wise, and then the second half will compare its antithesis or opposite, the foolish. And we read this, the wicked, the just, etc., etc. So basically what that means is that perpetuating conflicts is basically that's not the wise, but we're taught to forgive or cover transgression. The word cover is the theological term is expiate, and that means to cover for a sin. And reproof enters deeper into a wise man than 100 blows on a fool. So a little bit of verbal instruction will go a long way with a wise person, but a fool who understands force will only respond to force, and often, unfortunately, that's the only way to teach children. I think the French Enlightenment thinker Rousseau said, with men use reason, with children use force. Moving on to verse 11, an evil one seeks only rebellion, so a cruel messenger is sent against him. That's in accordance to their nature, so evil people are constantly seeking to undermine or subvert the established order, and it's testament to their nature. That's just what they do. Let a bereaved bear meet a man rather than a fool in his folly. So what he's doing is employing an animalistic analogy to the dangers of a foolish person in the midst of their foolishness. Foolish people bear out consequences that often incur deadly consequences, and it's every bit as comparable to a wild animal in the midst, or comparable to danger in that extent. And that's unfortunately all the time we have today, to be continued at a later date. Thank you.